So welcome everybody. We would like to welcome you to today is the last Honeycrisp meetup of this summer. We believe that we really have a nationwide conversation about Honeycrisp with fruit growers, extension educators, and scientists this summer. This extension effort between Washington State University, Michigan State University, and Cornell University was conducted in close collaboration with IFTA, the USDA SCRI Root to Fruit project, and Good Fruit Grower magazine. With so much new information generated through the Root to Fruit project about Honeycrisp, there is a tremendous value in having an open discussion and in a very inclusive virtual format this summer. Thanks for your participation, the Honeycrisp Meetup team, Bernardita from Washington State University, Anna Wallis, who was not able to be here from Michigan State University, and myself.
All right, well, Honeycrisp is pomology's problem child. Through all my readings of the literature, I've never seen anything quite as bad as Honeycrisp for wanting to be the center of attention. But I have my name down here as center of attention, and it's probably more appropriate to actually include the people that did the work. And as you'll see down here at the bottom, I'm also including Chris Watkins, Jennifer Diel, Inez Hanrahan, Jim Mathias, and soon enough, Carolina Torres. We'll see your name in here as well as I include some of your data. So first thing is to talk about harvest timing, I suppose. Honeycrisp, once again, a problem child. It's a really kind of difficult sort of apple to manage or try to fit into our normal kind of expectation for ripening fruits. But just in background, development, it is a continuous process, right, across the season. So starting out, very early in the season with flowering all the way through, it's just this developmental process. And then maturity begins to take place. But even within this developmental process, maturity is many, many different things. It's not just fruit size, it's fruit color, it's sugar accumulation, it's starch accumulation, and it's a conversion eventually of some of those materials to things that we want to eat. So the starches to the sugars, and then some of the things that are stored in an apple fruit to aroma compounds and that kind of thing. So there's loads and loads of biology that goes on. A lot of that latter stage is dependent on ethylene for those processes. Now, some aspects of ripening are only partly dependent on ethylene. So starch clearing, titratable acids shifting from high titratable acids to lower titratable acids, red color development, and some aroma compounds. Actually, those are not the more important ones. But then there are a few that are entirely dependent on ethylene. So the softening that takes place, ethylene formation itself, the respiratory burst, and most aroma compounds. So, without aroma, an apple doesn't taste like an apple, right? So it has to have at least that particular aspect. But all of those other things that we begin to expect with an apple fruit have to kind of come together into this nice package that we want to eat. So it's all dependent on maturity. Unfortunately, Honeycrisp is just kind of a problem. It has a very, very, I want to say, irregular ethylene production. So it's really difficult to sort of picture from there. And the starch index for Honeycrisp is atypical. And there are certain situations or conditions where the core of the cross section of the starch index pattern is black, stained with starch, and other times it clears like another apple variety might. So it's rather confusing. But what we've come down to, at least within my laboratory, our recommendations are to try to approach a starch index that's kind of in this range, where we've got about, anywhere from 40 to 60% of the total starch cleared, somewhere in that range. Firmness, if it can be managed, 15 to 16 pounds. Honeycrisp are never a really firm apple fruit, so 15 to 16 is about what you'll get. And after 6 months storage, it'll be at 14 pounds pressure. So not a real key indicator. Background color is rather important. I think we've been harvesting Honeycrisp, at least in Michigan, as we kind of we tend to harvest it maybe a little bit too mature, but somewhere in this 2 to 3 scale using the Macintosh chart for background color, and then DA meter 0.8 to 1.2. Then internal ethylene, if it's a good year where it's behaving properly, between 0.5 and 1 part per million. So if you see people like Craig or myself or others reporting on these maturity indices. This is kind of our targets here in Michigan. So then we get into the storage regimens, and I like to share this slide because it really helps kind of put us in that right mentality, right? That apple fruit are stored, but they're not storage organs. So you think of a potato is a storage organ. A sugar beet, that's a storage organ. And apple fruit is meant to be consumed, so that in evolutionary sense, the seeds are consumed and then spread. So the fruit are designed to be consumed, not stored. So we're trying to do something with a fruit that nature didn't really want it to do from the beginning. So that sets us up for, responses that are kind of unwanted on our part. So storage environments are stressful environments. And I have mentioned this in the past, but we start out with fruit that are in the sunshine, open air, 21% oxygen, and the temperatures are kind of moderate. And then we take those fruit, we put them in the dark, and we don't only put them in the dark for a short period, but for months at a time. And then we reduce the temperature on the fruit, and then we modify the atmosphere, and then we give them plant growth regulators on top of that. So for a plant material never to not respond in, let's say, an expected way, it's maybe not that surprising. And then on top of that, apples are variable. So from one harvest to another, one lot to another, and among the variable apples, I think Honeycrisp really kind of takes the cake. It's really right up there at the top. Marketing is unpredictable, and then humans are also fallible. So people make mistakes, and I've been involved in a number of sort of cases where things go wrong. And, one mistake, an apple might make it through, but if you start compiling mistakes like the high temperatures with the wrong oxygen concentration, you can completely lose your crop. So some of the disorders that we can talk about as you like, senescent breakdown is not one that's featured very much, but yeah, Honeycrisp gets a really nice version of senescent breakdown. Now the fruit will be relatively firm right up to the very end, and then it begins to undergo this browning, and you can notice it or understand that it's senescent breakdown by kind of this browning that starts on the outside and begins to diffuse its way to the inside, typically. And it's often accompanied with these kind of dark venation like this. So the higher the storage temperature, the more rapid this can happen. It might be suppressed a little bit by DPA, so I've seen some data to that effect, not on Honeycrisp, however. Low oxygen and MCP, those things that prevent senescence, prevent the aging process, control this, and pretty completely, actually, if done right. Soft scald is another big issue. This is a chilling disorder. As the fruit become more mature, they become more susceptible to it. Jennifer Diel showed the treatment in the field with 1-MCP can reduce soft scald development some. It's suppressed by elevated temperatures in storage. So 38 degrees Fahrenheit is what's recommended. And it's also suppressed by preconditioning. In any given year, one or the other of these two treatments is probably sufficient. But typically in most years, if you really want to be in a secure place, you do the preconditioning as well as the elevated storage. So I remember years where I tried to store the fruit at 0 degrees Celsius just to induce chilling injury and never got it. So it can happen. So 32 degrees Fahrenheit at 0 degrees Celsius. It's not controlled at all, as far as I know, by controlled atmosphere storage, and may or may not occur with soggy breakdown. You say, what soggy breakdown? Well, that's the twin sister, the ugly twin, I guess, of the exterior breakdown. Soggy breakdown occurs on the interior of the fruit. Sometimes you'll have both together. Sometimes you just have one or the other. But basically the same kinds of responses. The difference is I don't think it's affected by 1-MCP, so there's a slight difference in its sensitivity to 1-MCP. Not controlled by CA again, and may or not occur with storage scald, so it's twin. Diffuse internal browning, this is not an area that I've done much work in, but you can see from these photographs by Cindy Tong that you can get this diffuse internal browning. It's really a variety dependent disorder, and I rarely see it in Honeycrisp, but it can happen. Primarily chilling related, and I will impart one short story, and that is that I once stored Honeycrisp fruit after a really severe conditioning treatment. I stored them at 0 degrees Celsius. I did not see, so very cold temperatures, and I stored them that way for 6 months. I did not see soft scald on the outside, and I did not see soggy breakdown on the inside, but they all turned gray like this on the inside. So it's a chilling related disorder. Can be worse in cooler years. I guess out west, you guys don't have to worry about that at this point. Not controlled by diphenylamine, as far as I know, and associated with lower calcium, magnesium, calcium, and potassium ratios. Damage usually occurs in the first 3 to 5 months. One that I've probably done more work on than the others, fair enough to say this, I guess, yeah, is controlled atmosphere injury or CO2 injury. So I sometimes call it CA injury because low CO2 treatment, let's say 3% carbon dioxide given in air, has very little effect. But if you give CO2 with a 3% oxygen treatment, it can cause pretty severe injury. So there's a CO2 oxygen interplay. But it decreases with maturation. Like I say, it can be worse under low oxygen, which is why I call it CA injury. Completely controlled by diphenylamine. As long as the fruit have at least 3 days or so for the diphenylamine to internalize. It's minimized by conditioning. 3 days at 70 to 80 degrees Fahrenheit, 5 days at 60 to 70 degrees range, and 7 days at 50-degree range can minimize it. The lower the temperature of the conditioning, the less complete the control. Okay, so just keep that in mind. And it can be enhanced by 1-MCP, but I don't always see this response. And then damage usually occurs in the first 6 weeks of storage. But we have seen it occur as quickly as 3 days when we give very high CO2 concentrations. So the plant is immediately responsive to it in a storage environment. This is just a slide to remind me to talk about bitter pit. I'm only just beginning some work at Michigan State anyway on bitter pit, but we do have some data. This is where I steal it from Chris Watkins from New York. It's probably a good lead into whatever he's going to be saying. But I just want to remind folks that bitter pit, it's a calcium related disorder. How it's related to calcium, we don't really know, other than in low calcium level years with low calcium levels in the tissues, we have more bitter pit. But there are a number of other things associated with bitter pit, and I won't go into all the details here at this point. Talk about it as you like. In fact, Lee would be a very good person to bounce these things off of, the calcids. But early harvest, you can see that in Chris's data here, that bitter pit was higher for those early harvested fruit. And this is something that's been known for a number of years, but just a really nice thing to point out. And so when I talked earlier about the idea that maturation is a little difficult to assess, it's kind of an important thing to notice. And then once again, you can see soft scald and sulky breakdown responding to later and later harvests here. And then bitter pit can also be accentuated by some of these post-harvest treatments, including conditioning. So in the year that we collected this data here in Michigan State, we didn't see this relationship, but they surely did in New York State. So if you look at the bottom 4 down here, these are all conditioned fruit, and you can see that the bitter pit is about twice as high as those fruit that were not conditioned, given the other treatments. So we did a little bit of work a while back, just the idea of conditioning in the field. We left the fruit overnight or for 2 or 3 days in the field, just let them condition. It's just a reminder that, there's no magic place for this conditioning to take place. If they're left on an outside slab for a couple of days, they'll condition there just as easily as they will in a room. Now, I'm not so sure that that's food safety responsible, but just to know that these plants are responding to the temperature and the environment around them. I'm going to skip over that. And I wanted to get to this last slide here. And we're beginning to do some work now on dynamic CA storage. So a number of us here in the group tonight that are speaking or on the panel have done a bit of work, and I'll share some early work with you that we've done here. So this is some data looking at the lower oxygen limit. So basically, what is the lowest oxygen level you can get to for a variety? This is data for Empire, and what you can see is about 0.3% oxygen is the lower oxygen limit for Empire. And then you begin to see this real beautiful increase in fermentation that takes place. Very regular, very predictable, and about what we know. But the one thing that's kind of shocking is that low oxygen level. I mean, we've been storing Empire out here 1.5 to 3% oxygen for the last 60 years. And, look at all of the space we have to work with if you have the right kind of equipment to monitor. Here's Macintosh, a little bit more like what we normally expect, but once again, 1% oxygen or a little less, 0.7% was where the plant material didn't begin to ferment. So yeah, kind of an interesting range. Now we look at Honeycrisp, and you can see that Honeycrisp, and this is using the safe pod system, inducing fermentation. We got a slight increase in fermentation, but Honeycrisp just sort of didn't want to behave like the other fruits. So we get this beautiful swing in respiratory quotient, or in fermentation, as the oxygen goes down to nearly nothing. But in Honeycrisp, it just sort of behaves its own way. So like everything else, Honeycrisp seems to march to its own tune. We did some work with a different series of tools to kind of do the same measurement and found slightly different answers. So DCA versus like the tried and true measure of ethanol formation here. So what we're looking at is ethanol formation. We see a nice burst in ethanol formation. We don't necessarily see a shift in this case, the open dots here are carbon dioxide production, very little response. So there's still some mysteries out there at Honeycrisp, and we'll be unraveling them over the years, in the next few years. So last slide here, ripen. So Honeycrisp, I like to think of it as ripening with Macintosh-ish, but it's slow for color development. So often we harvest it a little bit over mature. Pre-harvest applications retained in 1 MCP are beneficial. You need the conditioning treatment for chilling sensitivity issues. Post-harvest MCP can be applied during conditioning. I don't talk about this much, but when you do, it actually it reduces the conditioning response for CA injury. So you can have a little bit higher CA injury in the case. CA injury, I don't talk about this too much, but it can occur in air storage. And we know this because when we treat with very low levels of diphenylamine, it completely eliminates CA injury, all that internal browning that takes place, even in air. And okay, CA storage, either don't use CA, store the fruit in 1 MCP. And we've done some of this kind of work with repeat treatments of 1 MCP, but basically 1 dose is all you're going to get away with, I think. Delayed CA storage 30 days before CA establishment, keep the CO2 low. You can do high temperature conditioning followed by controlled atmosphere storage, or you can use diphenylamine and treat it in almost any CA regimen that you would like, as long as you're above the lower oxygen limit. And I'm going to put that at around 1% or 0.5% of oxygen. That's it.